So for this video, we're just sharing my observations as a photojournalist. Is the news really, really biased? Is it biased in the sense that there's clearly an agenda? No. Is it biased in that people's lived experiences are going to influence how the story is told? You can make that argument, but I do want to say there is a vast difference between your lived experience shapes how you view the world, and that in turn shapes how you take factual evidence and how you present it, versus completely being a mouthpiece for a certain agenda, political party, whatever. I would say the vast majority of people that I've personally worked with do not do that. I will say if there is a bias, it's a corporate bias. It isn't a secret cabal of like, ooh, we're going to have a certain narrative. It's more like, we don't want to alienate certain advertisers, so we're going to try to make the story as palatable and as neutral as possible. That's what I mean when I say like there's a corporate bias. It's, Nelly, how do I put it? Like so much of the idea of news objectivity, it really boils down to being palatable for advertisers. And that started, I think that started with newspapers. It made its way into the television medium when that became the dominant medium in the media landscape. Now with social media, things are a little different, but at the end of the day, like especially with like legacy media, it's about advertising space. So that's what I mean with like a lot of the idea of like news objectivity started with the idea of not wanting to alienate potential advertisers, because at the end of the day, broadcast companies are companies. I did work for public media, and there is a little different standards for that. And I have worked in a conservative news station as well. So in those cases, like when I worked for the public media, it was I will say this, like regardless of whichever newsroom I've worked in, there has always been people on like both sides of the aisle. You get people who, think like me. I'll let you guess which side of the political aisle I, stand on. There are also people who were, pretty moderate, or people that are pretty conservative. I work with reporters that are like very conservative. And when I say conservative, I mean like Reagan era conservatism. I haven't worked so much with like a full like MAGA person. And I would prefer not to, but there's that. But I do know like other people in our company do subscribe to that way of thinking, and yet we still have to work together. So the majority of us just don't discuss our politics. Now, of course, when it comes to covering these stories, we do have an editorial staff just kind of making sure that we're trying to keep the coverage as balanced as possible. I'm learning about this. Well, I've known about this, but like I'm learning more about like what this meant. Back in the day, there was something called a Fairness Doctrine. And I believe it was like, I don't know if it was like a law or like a policy that was enforced by the FCC that basically said if you have a political story, you have to give, the same amount of airtime for, party A as you do party B. And here in the United States, we have a two-party system. We don't have a multi-party system. But yes, so if you have a Democratic candidate, you have to include the Republican. If you have a Republican talking point, you have to give the Democratic rebuttal. Reagan in the 1980s did away with that, saying that it no longer needs to be enforced. And that lack of a rule sort of paved the way to seeing outlets like Fox News in particular, because my goodness, they really like took that idea and ran with it. I know MSNBC is sort of seen as like the opposite of that, but I think like MSNBC is very like maybe left or center left, whereas Fox News has gotten progressively more and more to the, far right. So things like Fox News or MSNBC is different than what I work with, which is on the local level. On the local level, things are a little bit more even-keeled. Yes, I did work in one conservative news station. They were independent at the time. And those who know me know exactly who I'm talking about. They're a small San Diego conservative station that used to be owned by a company called like the McKinnon Corporation. It was like one family from Texas, and I got to see just like they did pull stories. They did pull stories that like climate stories, for example, but they did pull climate stories because they didn't like how it was presented. And that's the thing. Like, that was probably like the only time where I saw a very brazen, like, we clearly have an agenda, and this kind of speaks to the antithesis of that. Because it was like owned by one family, there was like a lot less buffer. If they weren't paying attention, you could pretty much do whatever you wanted, as long as it was like, it made for good TV. The majority of the reporters, by the way, who worked there, like, I don't think were as conservative as like the owners were. I think they wavered more like the center, but like for the most part, they didn't feel strongly one way or another. Granted, this was like 2014, so things have changed since then. But yeah, one reporter did a story with like the Salk Institute, which is like a university academic institute that researches like whatever. Oh, no. It was like the Scripps Institution of Oceanography. So marine biology. And they were talking about like how the temperature of the ocean has been rising over the past X amount of years, and they didn't like that because they wanted to, because they did not like the narrative that story had, even though the narrative was based off of science. And the reporter, I know at the time, was very, very upset that happened, and she tried fighting for it, but like I said, because of that lack of buffer, there wasn't really a whole lot of whatever they said went at that particular station. And I know she was pretty upset by how that story turned out, so I think she just decided not to air it at all. So I don't remember if it was like they specifically told her to pull it, or if it was like, make these changes or it doesn't air at all, and she chose not to air it. You know, so that was like the only time where I saw a very clear bias win out. When I worked at a public media station, I didn't really see any of that. Like, people associate the public media with like being very liberal or democratic. And individually, like, and by the way, this goes for all the stations that I've worked at, the conservative, the, you know, whatever. Compared to like that station being conservative, I've never worked at a station that was like just as much on like the liberal or even leftist side, like nowhere close. It's always been pretty like center, neutral, or like super duper conservative. So take that information how you will. But even at the most conservative station I've worked at, a lot of people there were pretty liberal or left-leaning, but they weren't the producers, they weren't the owner. Well, even the producers were whatever, but like the executive producers and the owners were very clearly conservative. The news director, I believe, is very conservative. So that's why their word went out. When I worked in public media, the majority of the people there, I think, were like left-leaning, but like, and I hate to make this comparison, but some of them kind of gave me the impression as like, you know, the dad from Get Out that said like, I would vote for Obama for a third time if I could. It was a lot of that. They weren't the worst people that I worked with, but my goodness, like some particular individuals I did not care for, because I did not think, because I thought they were a much more ego driven, you know, and that's the thing too. Like, by the way, if anyone sees this and takes this out of context, I want to be clear, like, we need public media. Like, the fact that it's being defunded right now, like, drives me up a fucking wall. But like, just those particular individuals I did not get along with, because I did not think, I don't know, how do I put it? It was like academic ego. They were more interested in sounding smart than they were in the actual story, in my opinion. Who knows what they thought? But even with that, they didn't have an agenda per se. They were just saying a lot of like smart sounding words and calling it a news story. So it was more that. They also had a much stricter editorial staff. I do think that on paper is a good thing. I do agree with it, like the concept of like having an editorial staff. I do think a lot of the people, I don't want to say a lot, like I think the majority of the people did a good job, but I do think they got a little bit too focused on minute details of a story and how it might come across versus, you know, maybe zooming out and looking at the big picture. So for example, I wanted to cover the Oceanside powwow. The news director advised against it because she was afraid that it was going to make like other powwows jealous or something. And then I just kind of did a story on it anyway. And it, you know, it had aired and it became an article online, and it did like reasonably well on the website. And by the way, I asked the organizers of the powwow, they're like, it's like the same people going to all the powwows or nationwide. Like, no, we're not going to get jealous, like whatever. So I don't know. It was things like that. So was that an agenda? No, I don't think it was. Could you argue that she was a little out of touch? I personally think that she was. I think she had good intentions. I think she was doing the best with the situation she was given, but I do think it was a little out of touch. But here's the thing, is that bias? I don't think it was. I think their intentions were in the right place. I think it became more of a, oh, there goes that. Okay, so I think that was more of a logistical problem. I think it was managerial shortcomings. I don't think it was clearly due to bias. And I think that's the difference, right? I don't think the road to hell is paved with good intentions, as they say. Was there lots of room for improvement at that station? I'm inclined to believe so. Was it due to bias or things done in bad faith? I don't think it was either. I just think it was just due to incompetence, but well-intentioned incompetence, if that makes sense. Right. So, okay, the last question that remains is like, what do you do when you as a journalist have like personal views on a certain subject? Are you allowed to post about it on your social media platforms? And the short answer is no, usually no, because of contractual obligations. So because, so when you sign on to be a television reporter, you sign on to be you sign on to let them use your likeness, let the company use your likeness, and you become part of the brand for as long as that contract is in place. And that includes them monitoring your social media content. We have done trainings on this because going back to, palatability, they don't want us to make something that's very inflammatory and risk eroding that trust of the audience. Sometimes, yes, it circles back to advertisements, but that's more kind of on the back end of things. When we're out in the community, people are already going to have their like impressions of like people who work for the news. And if they can see on your page, oh, this person supports issue X and I'm against issue X, they're for it, that's going to erode that public trust. Now, do I necessarily agree with it? Yes and no. I agree in the sense that, yes, because you represent the company, you do need to be over what you can and can't post on your social media, and taking a stance risks controversy. With that said, I also think, we are currently living in times where the media has also has come under fire. I mean, during, Trump's first administration, there was a lot of anti-media rhetoric, the fake news and yada yada. And I think, well, and that's the thing, like, when you're working in a media landscape where people already dislike you, I'm not saying you have to, like, go on a rant and say, like, let me tell you what I really think. But there's a difference between I'm against a, like, foreign policy thing versus I'm against, punching down on a whole group of people. And I personally think that that's where we're at now. No, I'm not. And even me, like, I haven't signed a contract because I'm a, news photographer. I'm not on-air talent, but I still need to keep in mind, because by the way, your boss, regardless of where you work, your boss is monitoring your social media feeds no matter where you work. Keep that in mind. And I try to be mindful of that too, which is why, like, I don't want to say, like, who I work for just for, my own employment purposes. But yeah, it's finding that balance. Finding that balance between, do you take a stand and risk alienating this group of people, or do you just try to remain as neutral as possible so you can continue doing your job? Because, by the way, we also work a lot with, like, law enforcement, politicians, things like that. And I can speak from experience, like, working with, like, police public information officers. If they know that you're anti-cop, they will be much less inclined to work with you. Technically, they have to, no matter, which publication you work for, but it's like subtle things, like they might take 5 hours to give you a statement instead of, 30 minutes. It's like things like that. Or with politicians, they can just, they don't know you shit. They can straight up refuse to give you an interview or whatever because they don't like you. And I've seen politicians do that. So, and by the way, I'm talking about, like, local politicians, like county board of supervisors, city council, like that kind of thing. I'm not naming names, but it's just, yeah. That's why it's very important for, you as a journalist to really be careful with what you post on air, or what you post on your social media feeds. what I've seen people do for issues that they care about is they just kind of repost a lot of what they, like, for example, like the AP is considered to be like a pretty like neutral media outlet. They just report on here's what's going on. And for the most part, and we can get into that in another video, they have been very like, I have not seen a particular slant with their coverage. I've seen the comments calling for them to change their titles or whatever. And by the way things are phrased, like that is a form of bias, you know, but that'll be like my final point. But point is, a lot of reporters or on-air people will like repost a lot of stories on their feeds for issues that they care about, but done in a way where there's like, I'm just reposting this and I'm just leaving it at that. You can read the article yourself. It's different, you know, or sometimes it will share personal experiences like, hey, my mother was an immigrant and this is why she's inspiring to me. But it's not done in a way where they're like specifically saying politician X is a bad person because of blah, 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 blah. I haven't personally seen this happen, but I know of other people in different news markets who have been fired from their jobs because they took a very bold approach. The examples that were presented to me were usually like, they're just very obnoxious, and it kind of left me with the impression that there wasn't a whole lot of sympathy for them. And here's the thing, like, they're allowed to post, you're allowed to do whatever you want, but you can't escape the consequences of your actions if it doesn't turn out in the way that you want it to. So that's why it's important to be careful. Like, the last thing I will say is just like bias, you know, the way things are phrased is a form of bias. And here's what I mean by that. I remember hearing this example in a political science class in college. If there is a vaccine for and by the way, this is not a COVID reference, this is just an example. If there's a disease that is like killing, like that has like a 100% fatality rate, and this vaccine gives you an 80% survival rate, that means 20% of the people take vaccine and still die. So do you say this has an 80% success rate, or do you say it has a 20% failure rate? Both are true, but one clearly has like a positive slant and one has a negative. So it's things like that. Circling back to, you know, the woman in Minneapolis, it's like law enforcement say a woman was killed by an ICE officer. You know, whereas I see a lot of like people calling in the comment section, like, call it what it is, an ICE officer murdered an innocent bystander or murdered an innocent woman, you know. And I have my opinions on that, which I will not get into here because I'm, you know, that's not the point of this video. But it's just how headlines are phrased. And from my perspective, like, the reason why it's phrased like that is because they don't want to alienate themselves from like being in touch with the local authorities of that area. Because like, we as journalists, like, I live in San Diego, we are in touch with ICE all the time. The spokespeople, you know, like I said, like, they don't like us, generally speaking, at least that's my impression, but they have to talk to us because that's what the point of having like a public information officer, that's what it's for, or a spokesperson. But like I said, it's like, if they think that we're more sympathetic to them, they'll probably get back to us quicker with like a statement. And if they don't like us, then like, I've, for example, have tried reaching out to them for like other news stories that I was working on. They didn't respond to me at all. And then we say, we reached out to ICE, they did not respond. So I don't know. I will say this too, like, my mom is from Mexico. I have personally faced a lot of like racism in my childhood and still face racism occasionally. It's not nearly as bad as like, I guess you could say not nearly as bad as how other people have it, but I still have to reconcile with it sometimes. And I've also been like, whatever. I do feel like sometimes there is a target on my back when I go out and cover these stories. But what do I say this? I've seen what's going on with like ICE and who they're arresting, and it infuriates me like beyond belief, you know. Or I've covered stories that involve like queer kids losing funding for schools because someone like got like transphobic on like their school board, and again it incenses me. It fills me with rage that this is even going on. But also, it would be irresponsible of me if I let my emotions take over too. And like, and again, my perspective is a little different because I'm not the on-air talent. If I was, though, Like, and I'm not saying like you have to like tamp it all down. There is a way, in my opinion, where you can express these things and paint a broader picture that, you know, whatever. I grew up with a lot of queer kids. I grew up closely to the queer community. It is something that's important to me because I'm Mexican, because my mom is an immigrant. Immigration stories are very, very important to me because I feel like I have a personal stake in it. Not simply because like I was born here. My mom has been a naturalized citizen for, you know, decades, but given the rhetoric that's going on here, like I do fear a little bit for my future. I fear a little bit for her future. I don't think something bad is going to happen tomorrow, you know, on a federal level, but like I don't like the direction we're heading in. I'll say that much. And it is concerning. But again, do you let your emotions take over the story? I personally think it's irresponsible to do that because, you know, again, you have to maintain that balance between public trust, working with, you know, authorities, and trying to tell the story as accurately as possible. People have been pretty and again, and that's where it comes down to phrasing. I've seen more reporters just kind of be a little bit more like low-key calling, and this is not specific to like ICE or ICE related stories, but like when there's an injustice that happens, they're a little bit more willing to like call it just that, an injustice, you know. Sometimes they'll attribute it to activists, sometimes or whatever, but like they'll tweak the wording a little bit to kind of invoke that, oh, an injustice occurred here, and that's why people are upset. As opposed to a super duper neutral milquetoast, I don't want to piss off anybody. A thing happened, and it was unfortunate that a thing that unfortunately happened affected someone negatively. Like, you know, yeah, I know this is a very like long, rambly video. But I don't know. I think this stuff is interesting, and like, as someone who's been in the news industry, who has actually been like verbally accosted and also physically attacked by crazy people that don't understand these things, you know, because they don't want to understand these things, I do want to at least dispel some like misconceptions over how this stuff works. Not just for my own safety, but, you know, because I'm under the impression that, you know, like in every authoritarian government, like they always want to keep very tight control over the media. And I think by at least talking about these things while I have the chance, you know, it can at least give you the viewer, a little bit more insight over what goes on behind the scenes. We are human beings just like you. We have our lived experiences. Some of us are conservative, some of us are liberal. We have to work with each other. We have to work with each other. We usually, you know, or at least for the majority of my career, we check our politics out the door. But now I think more people are understanding that, like, a lot of these political issues aren't just about like foreign policy or budgets. It's calling our very humanity into question. Are we, as whoever, immigrants, queer people, brown people, whatever it is, are we even allowed to be here, exist in public, you know? And when things happen like that, granted, I work in a news station that's like a lot more sympathetic to that kind of stuff, but like, while there is a balance of like, yes, we need to try to remain objective and unbiased, like sometimes you gotta call it out for what it is, which is like absolute BS that we're even having these conversations. The fact that we have to, you know, like people are being a lot more open to the fact that like, no, people's humanity should not be called into question, should not be up for debate, you know. And I'm glad to see, especially younger journalists who are like just now breaking in, I think are, you know, my goodness, I've seen such a fire in their eyes, like that is like truly inspiring, you know, and I hope that fire doesn't get tamped out. This can be a very brutal industry, you know, and you really got to be passionate about this stuff, because this is like, we are not the vast majority of people in the news industry do not make a whole lot of money doing this, by the way. You really got to be passionate about these issues, about journalism, to stay in it. Why did I stay in it? You know, I don't know. But I do have a video talking about how I got started in it. It kind of started on accident. Thanks to a shitty relationship and, you know, $8 a dream and a weird Russian boyfriend who was not very nice to me. But anyway, thanks for listening to this long ass rambly video. I'm not looking forward to editing this down, but you know, whatever. Just to repeat myself, hi, I'm Andy. I'm a photojournalist by trade. And I also do comics. I also have a couple blogs up that are just like me showcasing cool like subculture events. So if this is the stuff you're into, this is the channel for you. Yeah, thank you again for watching. I'll see you in the next one, and be safe out there. Anyway, until next time, friends, bye.